Why does heartbreak actually hurt? The question sounds poetic, at first perhaps the stuff of sad songs or quiet journal entries, but science demands a more literal investigation. Because the truth is, heartbreak doesn't just feel like pain, it is pain. When we lose someone we love, whether by death, separation, or betrayal, our bodies respond as if we've been physically wounded. Brain scans light up in the same regions activated by actual bodily injury. People report tightness in the chest, shortness of breath, dizziness, nausea. But why? What evolutionary function does this pain serve? If pain exists to protect us from danger, then what danger is heartbreak warning us about? This isn't just a metaphor. There's a condition called Takotsubo Cardiomyopathy, more commonly known as broken heart syndrome. It mimics a heart attack, so convincingly that people rush to emergency rooms in full-blown cardiac distress. EKGs show abnormal rhythms. The heart's left ventricle balloons into a strange shape like a Japanese octopus trap, or Takotsubo, for which the syndrome is named, and blood tests reveal elevated enzymes typically associated with cardiac damage. Yet, when doctors search for the telltale blockage that causes classic heart attacks, they find nothing. No clots, no plaques, just a heart overwhelmed by grief. And while most patients recover, some don't. Some die, not from disease or trauma, but from emotional devastation made cellular. This phenomenon begs a deeper question. How can something as intangible as emotion wreak such tangible havoc? What does it mean that the loss of love or even rejection can trigger a full-blown physiological crisis? The answer isn't merely psychological, it's evolutionary. It speaks to how profoundly social we are, how our survival as a species has long depended not just on food or shelter or escape from predators, but on the presence, support, and affection of others. It hints at the terrifying power of attachment, not just as a source of comfort, but as a life or death necessity embedded in our biology. Heartbreak hurts because it's supposed to, not because nature is cruel, but because once upon a time, being cast out from the group or losing a crucial bond was a kind of death, and the body, in all its ancient wisdom, still remembers. Pain, we're often told, is a signal evolutionary messenger alerting the body to injury. Touch a hot stove, and pain pulls your hand back before damage becomes irreversible. But not all pain is physical. The pain of heartbreak, rejection, or bereavement doesn't show up as burns or bruises, yet it can be just as intense, even disabling. For decades, scientists viewed emotional distress as separate from physical agony, but advances in neuroscience have revealed a surprising truth. Emotional pain and physical pain aren't just metaphorically similar, they're neurologically intertwined. At the center of this connection lies a small but crucial region of the brain known as the anterior cingulate cortex (ACC), which processes both physical and social pain. Brain scans show that when a person experiences heartbreak, the ACC lights up in the same way it does when they're physically injured. In other words, the brain doesn't seem to distinguish much between a broken leg and a broken heart. This overlap in brain circuitry makes sense when viewed through the lens of survival. Evolution has equipped us with pain as a form of protection, a deterrent to harmful behavior, and a motivator to seek safety and healing. When our ancestors wandered too close to a fire or were wounded in a hunt, pain taught them to avoid repeating the same mistakes. But physical threats weren't the only dangers they faced. For early humans, social bonds were as vital to survival as food and shelter. To be cast out from a tribe was effectively a death sentence, exposing one to starvation, predators, or rival groups. Attachment wasn't just emotional, it was existential. Evolution, in its relentless efficiency, forged a second kind of pain. Social pain, a system designed to monitor and preserve human connection. Losing a loved one, being rejected, or feeling excluded triggered the same neural alarms as a stab, wound, or a burn. Emotional suffering, in this context, wasn't weakness, it was a life-saving warning. The biological cascade that follows, heartbreak, reinforces this link between emotional and physical distress. When someone experiences a major emotional trauma, like a breakup, a death, or betrayal, their body releases a flood of stress hormones, including cortisol and norepinephrine. These are the same chemicals released in response to physical injury or danger. Cortisol, often called the stress hormone, increases blood pressure, suppresses the immune system, and disrupts sleep, while norepinephrine ramps up heart rate and primes the body for fight or flight. In short bursts, these hormones are adaptive, but when heartbreak drags on, as it often does, this biochemical storm can become toxic, wearing down the heart, gut, brain, and immune system. This is part of what makes grief so physically exhausting. Why, in extreme cases, it can lead to conditions like Takotsubo Cardiomyopathy. The body experiences the emotional wound as if it were a physical trauma, with all the physiological consequences that implies. This ancient system still governs us today, but the world it was designed for no longer exists. In modern society, we don't rely on small tribal groups for survival. We live in sprawling cities, networked digitally more than physically, and our most devastating losses now often occur not in the savannas or forests of our evolutionary past, but in text, messages, emails, or sudden silences. Yet our bodies haven't updated their software. When we are ghosted by someone we love, when a relationship falls apart, when a spouse dies, or when a close friend betrays us, our ancient alarm systems are triggered as if we've been left behind in the wilderness. The same response kicks in, the same flood of stress hormones courses through our veins, the same regions in our brain activate, telling us we are in danger even if that danger is no longer existential in the way it once was. What's more, the modern world may actually be amplifying the effects of social pain. Technology, while connecting us superficially, often deepens feelings of isolation. Social media showcases curated lives and happy connections, making heartbreak feel more acute by comparison. Ghosting, a uniquely modern form of rejection, creates psychological ambiguity that the brain hates, leaving people stuck in a loop of searching for meaning and closure. The epidemic of loneliness is only growing, and science is beginning to take it seriously. Meta-analyses across decades of data have found that chronic loneliness is more lethal than obesity, excessive alcohol use, or even smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Loneliness increases the risk of heart disease, stroke, dementia, depression, and premature death. It's not just a psychological state, a physiological one. Just like heartbreak, it's processed in the brain as a form of pain. And like pain, it warns us. Something is wrong. We are in danger, even if we can't see the threat. Understanding this evolutionary backstory helps us make sense of heartbreak's intensity. We are not weak for collapsing under the weight of grief or loneliness. We are simply human, biologically programmed to value love, to need connection, and to suffer in its absence. The systems designed to protect us thousands of years ago are still firing, even if the dangers have shifted. The pain of heartbreak, then, is not an error. It is a message, an ancient one, telling us that we have lost something vital and urging us to seek it again, not just for our happiness, but for our survival. The early 2000s marked a turning point in the scientific understanding of emotional pain, particularly with the advent of functional magnetic resonance imaging fMRI, which allowed researchers to peer into the living brain in real time. One of the most influential breakthroughs came from a deceptively simple study. Researchers asked participants to play a virtual ball-tossing game called Cyberball. Unbeknownst to the players, the game was rigged. After a few rounds, the virtual partners stopped throwing the ball to the participant, effectively excluding them from the group. What happened next was startling. As the participants experienced social rejection, their brain scans lit up not in abstract or uniquely emotional areas, but in the same regions associated with physical pain, particularly the dorsal anterior, cingulate cortex, DACC, and the anterior insula. These are the very circuits that activate when you stub your toe or suffer a burn. The implication was clear. The brain processes social pain through the same neural pathways it uses to process physical pain. At the forefront of this discovery were psychologists Naomi Eisenberger and Matthew Lieberman, whose work gave birth to the revolutionary phrase, "Social pain is real pain." Their research provided the first hard evidence that the heartbreak we feel isn't all in our heads, in the dismissive, metaphorical sense. It is, quite literally, in our nervous system. The physical architecture of our brains doesn't neatly separate emotional wounds from physical injuries. On the contrary, it conflates the two. In evolutionary terms, this makes perfect sense. Our ancestors who felt acute distress at social rejection were more likely to stay bonded with their group and, thus, more likely to survive. But for modern science, the implications were paradigm-shifting. Emotional pain was no longer a fuzzy, subjective experience, something to be endured silently or dismissed as weakness. It was a legitimate biological event, trackable, measurable, and painfully real. This discovery introduced a profound dilemma. If social rejection and heartbreak feel neurologically identical to physical injury, should we begin treating them that way? Should heartbreak be taken as seriously as a broken bone? Should mental health interventions mirror the urgency and care we give to physical trauma? The medical field has long operated under a dualistic model, treating the body and mind as separate domains. Yet these findings challenge that very division. The same brain that cries out from a knife wound cries out from loneliness or loss. And yet our societal systems are not built to accommodate this truth. Few doctors are trained to treat emotional pain as anything more than a secondary concern. Insurance rarely covers grief or romantic despair. In schools and workplaces, emotional pain is often sidelined or minimized, as if feelings are optional distractions from the real business of life. This clash between science and culture is especially sharp in Western societies, where individualism, stoicism, and productivity dominate the cultural script. Phrases like mind over matter, tough it out, and just get over it echo everywhere from locker rooms to boardrooms, reinforcing the idea that emotional distress is a personal failing rather than a neurological event. But the brain doesn't recognize this divide. It doesn't know that social pain is supposed to be less serious. It registers heartbreak as damage, full stop. And ignoring it doesn't make the pain go away, intensifies it, just as ignoring a broken ankle while trying to run a marathon would. This cultural dissonance leaves people suffering in silence, invalidated not just by their circumstances, but by the very systems meant to support them. The inciting discovery that the brain makes no clear distinction between physical and emotional. Pain forces us to confront a pressing question. What does it mean to be human in a world that increasingly denies our most human vulnerabilities? As the science grows louder, the conflict between what we know biologically and what we practice socially becomes harder to ignore. Emotional pain, heartbreak, grief, rejection, they're not weaknesses to outgrow or ignore. They are injuries, real and raw, and they deserve to be treated as such. Throughout history, stories abound of powerful figures who crumbled not from battle wounds or disease, but from grief. The annals of ancient Rome speak of Emperor Hadrian wasting away after the death of his beloved Antinous. Queen Victoria wore mourning black for 40 years following Prince Albert's passing, reportedly never recovering from the loss. In more recent times, we've seen public figures visibly deteriorate after the death of a spouse or child, as though their bodies, not just their hearts, failed them. And these aren't just anecdotes. Modern medical research supports the idea that profound emotional loss can be fatal. One striking body of evidence concerns elderly couples. When one partner dies, the other's risk of death skyrockets in the months that follow, not from the same illness, but from something less tangible and far more elusive. Studies consistently show increased rates of heart failure, stroke, immune collapse, and even accidental death among the bereaved. Grief, in these cases, acts like a contagion. It weakens, it overwhelms, and sometimes it kills. The biological impact of love and its absences, perhaps most heart-wrenchingly visible in children. Decades of studies in orphanages and war-torn regions have revealed that children deprived of emotional warmth, despite receiving enough food and basic care, often show stunted growth, delayed cognitive development, and fragile immune systems. This phenomenon, known as psychosocial dwarfism, shows that a child's body literally withholds growth in the absence of affection. More recently, research on infants in neglectful environments reveals chronically elevated cortisol levels, signs of inflammation, and altered brain architecture changes typically associated with trauma. These children aren't dying from lack of nutrition. They're suffering the biological fallout of emotional abandonment. It's a brutal reminder that connection isn't a luxury, it's a foundational need. Love is not a bonus feature of life. It is part of our biology. Despite this overwhelming evidence, modern society continues to misunderstand and undervalue emotional pain. We live in an era of self-help slogans and curated happiness, where pop psychology and toxic positivity promise that mindset alone can conquer suffering. Grief, depression, heartbreak, they're often reduced to temporary mental fogs to be hacked or outpaced. Workplace wellness initiatives urge employees to meditate away burnout, while subtly reinforcing that real pain is disruptive, inconvenient, or worse, unproductive. The result is a culture in which people feel compelled to mask their emotional injuries, fearing they'll be labeled fragile or inefficient. Yet the physiological cost of suppressing grief is steep. Studies have shown that unprocessed emotional trauma can lead to increased inflammation, autoimmune disorders, cardiovascular disease, and gastrointestinal issues. Burnout isn't just about being tired. It's often unresolved sorrow, compressed and ignored until it hardens into illness. This creates an increasingly urgent moral dilemma. If emotional pain is bodily pain, how should healthcare respond? Should grief counseling be treated with the same urgency and coverage as a broken arm? Should insurance plans recognize heartbreak therapy as preventive care? These questions blur the boundaries of medicine, psychology, and culture. Some argue that medicalizing grief risks stripping it of its sacred, human dimension, turning a universal emotional process into a clinical diagnosis. Others counter that ignoring grief's physical toll is a form of systemic neglect, one that worsens outcomes and reinforces inequality. For those who cannot afford extended leave, therapy, or social support, the body bears the cost in silence. And in failing to make space for suffering, we turn it inward, transforming it into chronic pain, depression, or disease. As these tensions mount, we're left to confront deeper societal questions. What happens to a culture that treats emotional injury as weakness? What happens when we demand that people bounce back from death, betrayal, or trauma as if nothing has changed? We may say grief is natural, but everything in our systems or workplaces, our schools, our healthcare, our media suggests that grief must be hidden, managed, or conquered quickly. The pressure to suppress pain, to perform resilience, creates a dangerous illusion that healing is a matter of willpower. But repression has a cost. Grief that's swallowed instead of spoken festers in the body. Pain denied doesn't vanish, it mutates. The rising rates of anxiety, chronic illness, addiction, and depression in the modern world are not just random afflictions, they are symptoms of a deeper wound, one we're often too ashamed to acknowledge. In confronting this reality, we find ourselves at a crossroads. Science is telling us that heartbreak is real, measurable, and damaging in ways we've only begun to grasp. Yet culture continues to demand stoicism, to treat emotional vulnerability as an obstacle rather than a signal. The result is a quiet, collective suffering people navigating profound pain in a world that doesn't know how to hold it. And so the questions intensify. If we continue to ignore the body's cries for connection, what will be the cost, not just individually, but as a society? What does it mean to grieve in a world that fears grief? The answers are not simple, but they are necessary. Because in acknowledging the full weight of heartbreak, we begin not only to understand if we begin to heal. The true revelation in the science of heartbreak isn't just that emotional pain is real, or that the brain processes social loss like physical injury. It's something even more intimate and profound. Neuroscience has shown that the same neural circuits that light up when we form deep attachments, the reward centers that release oxytocin during bonding, the pathways that generate feelings of safety and connection, are the very same ones that activate in the wake of loss. Love and grief aren't opposites. They're entwined in a shared biological system. When we love someone, our brain weaves them into the fabric of our survival. Their presence becomes a source of emotional regulation, neurological reward, and even physiological stability. When they're gone, whether by death, betrayal, or distance, the body doesn't just experience their absence as an emotional inconvenience. It experiences it as an injury to the system built to ensure we stay alive through them. This is the twist that turns heartbreak from an abstract sadness into a tangible wound. Grief isn't a malfunction. It's not a breakdown in the system. It is the system working exactly as it was designed. The pain we feel in loss is not a sign of weakness or failure. It's a biological tribute to the love that came before it. The same circuitry that made intimacy feel warm, safe, and rewarding now cries out when that source of regulation disappears. In that sense, grief is not evidence that something has gone wrong. It's the echo of a bond so deeply embedded in the body that its rupture sends the whole system into alarm. The broken heart is not a metaphor. It is the literal response of a body that had reorganized itself around another person's presence, and now must relearn how to exist in their absence. This realization reframes the entire experience of emotional suffering. Pain, we've been taught, is merely a warning sign, a signal that something needs to be fixed. But in the context of love, pain is also a measure. It's a mirror of connection. The deeper the love, the deeper the wound. Not because we've failed to cope, but because our biology has succeeded in doing what it was built for: bonding, trusting, depending. And so, when that bond is severed, the fallout is not just psychological, it's systemic. The heart races, sleep shatters, immunity weakens, focus disappears. These aren't malfunctions. They are the body's attempts to recalibrate after losing a person it had counted on for stability. The final meta-level twist is this: pain, in this context, is not just a symptom. It is a marker of depth, of meaning, of life shared. We hurt because we connected, and the connection was real. The nervous system doesn't lie. It doesn't light up like that for someone who didn't matter. In a way, grief is the body's eulogy, delivered in hormones and heartbeats. It's how our biology says, asterisk, this mattered. This person was part of me. Asterisk, and that means something astonishing. Our pain is proof of love. Not just in a poetic sense, but in a literal, physiological one. Grief, then, is not what we endure in spite of love, is what we endure because of it. And in that truth lies not just sorrow, but honor. In the wake of all this scientific revelation, one truth becomes clear. Grief is not a defect. It is not weakness, dysfunction, or pathology. It is a deeply embedded biological process, an ancient mechanism meant to help us survive by mourning what we've lost, recalibrating the system, and relearning how to live without what once grounded us. And as researchers delve deeper into the physiology of grief, they're finding that when it is treated with the same seriousness and care as physical trauma, outcomes significantly improve. Just as a broken leg requires rest, support, and gradual rehabilitation, so too does a broken heart. Studies now confirm that giving space for grief, for acknowledging it, validating it, and supporting the body through it leads to better emotional resilience, lower rates of chronic illness, and improved long-term mental health. Grief, like all wounds, needs tending. One of the most potent tools in this process is physical comfort. The very same oxytocin system that bonds us to others doesn't disappear when they're gone. It still craves regulation. Research shows that touch, hugs, hand-holding, even the gentle presence of a loved one can directly reduce cortisol, the stress hormone that floods the system in times of emotional crisis. Oxytocin, often called the love hormone, isn't just about romantic connection. It's about soothing, safety, and stability. When administered through meaningful human contact, it can lower inflammation, steady heart rate, and restore a sense of grounding. In a grieving body, this biochemical bomb can mean the difference between spiraling into illness and slowly, gently healing. This has led to a shift still nascent, but growing, in how institutions approach grief, hospitals and mental health. Professionals are beginning to integrate grief protocols, not as optional extras, but as critical components of healthcare. Palliative care units now increasingly include grief counseling for families, recognizing that their well-being is not separate from the patient's. Some health systems are even experimenting with coordinated aftercare for widowed or bereaved patients, screening for signs of physical deterioration that might otherwise be overlooked. On the therapeutic side, approaches like mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, Somatic therapy and trauma-informed care are being used to help grieving individuals reconnect with their bodies in the aftermath of loss. In some cases, carefully managed medications that regulate the nervous system can ease the somatic symptoms of heartbreak, especially in cases of prolonged or complicated grief. The overarching insight is this: grief is not a mental lapse. It is not something to be conquered or ignored. It is a full-bodied experience, rooted in neural networks, hormonal cascades, and evolutionary wiring. It's what happens when the system, built for love, must suddenly contend with loss. And that system deserves respect, not just poetic acknowledgement, but real, structured support. When we understand grief through the lens of science, it doesn't make it any less human, it makes it more so. We begin to see pain not as a failure of coping, but as a mark of depth and connection. We begin to see healing not as returning to normal, but as rebuilding after a true physiological rupture. Ultimately, this shift in understanding offers something more powerful than just insight. It offers compassion, to know that our suffering is not imagined, exaggerated, or indulgent, but biologically real and valid, is to lift a weight that so many carry in silence. And in lifting that weight, we make space for genuine recovery. We stop trying to rush or rationalize our grief, and instead learn how to hold it, move with it, and allow it to shape us gently rather than break us. Because grief, in the end, is not the enemy of life, it is one of its deepest affirmations. A sign that we have loved, a sign that we are wired to need each other, and a reminder that even in the ache of absence, we are never alone. Imagine, just for a moment, if we treated emotional injuries with the same reverence we offer to broken bones. If, instead of urging people to move on or stay strong, we offered them rest, protection, and space to heal. If we acknowledged heartbreak not as an embarrassing crack in one's resilience, but as a natural and necessary response to losing something or someone that mattered. What would change if grief weren't hidden behind forced smiles or masked beneath productivity, but allowed to be exactly what it is, a deep, physical and emotional recalibration in the face of loss? The ache you feel after loss is not a flaw in your design. It is your body's way of saying, what we had was real. You mattered. This mattered, that trembling in your chest, the breath that catches without warning, the sudden flood of tears at the sound of a familiar song. These are not weaknesses. They are the echoes of a bond that shaped you, a living memory embedded into the nervous system itself. They are evidence of love's imprint, not just in your heart, but in your biology. And when that connection is broken, the body grieves in earnest because it must. In the end, pain is the body's way of remembering. It remembers the safety of being held, the rhythm of shared laughter, the comfort of routine presence. And in that remembering, there is more than hurt. There is proof, raw, visceral proof that love once lived here. That it rooted itself deep in the mind and body, and in leaving, it left a hollow that no amount of logic can easily fill. But even in the hollowness, there is something sacred, a whisper that says, you were changed by this. You belonged to something larger than yourself. So perhaps healing isn't about forgetting or replacing, but about learning to live with what love has carved into us, to carry the ache with gentleness, to know that it is not the enemy of joy, but the shadow of love's depth, and to realize that even our sorrow is a sign of something beautiful, that we are the kind of creatures capable of loving so deeply that it echoes long after the other is gone. What greater testament to connection could there be? In this way, grief doesn't just remind us of what we've lost. It reminds us of who we are, of how profoundly we're wired to reach for each other, to depend, to bond, to break and, somehow, to begin again.